The wind in Wyoming had no kindness in it. It was a wild thing, born in the jagged teeth of the mountains and let loose across the prairie to scour the land clean. It flattened the tall grass, stole the warmth from a man's coat, and carried the taste of dust and loneliness for 100 miles. In winter, it was a killer, sharp with ice and driving snow so thick it could swallow a house whole, leaving nothing but a white grave. This was a country that did not care if you lived or died. It only cared that you were strong enough to endure. Clara Bethune understood endurance. She had been enduring for all of her 23 years. She watched this raw, empty land slide past the grimy window of the train, her reflection a pale ghost against the endless brown and gray. Back in Missouri, the trees had been thick and the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. It had been a different kind of prison, one with green walls and whispering neighbors. This place was a cage of a different sort, one with no walls at all, only a horizon that promised more of the same hard emptiness. But emptiness, she thought, might be better than the alternative. The alternative had a name, Mr. Abernathy, a man twice her age, with a soft, damp handshake and eyes as cold and gray as river stones. He was a wealthy widower whose first wife had died under circumstances the whole town whispered about but never dared question. Clara's uncle, a man whittled down to a nub by drink and gambling debts, had seen Mr. Abernathy's wealth as his salvation. He had seen his orphan niece as currency. "It is a respectable match, Clara," her uncle had said, his voice slick with false propriety while his eyes darted about, unable to meet hers. "He will provide for you. You will be a lady of means." Clara knew what she would be. She would be a possession. She had felt it in the way Mr. Abernathy's hand lingered on her arm, his thumb pressing into the delicate skin of her wrist with a pressure that was not affectionate, but proprietary. She had seen the flicker of violence in his eyes when she had once flinched from his touch. He was a man who enjoyed fear in a woman. It was a sport to him. Her uncle, desperate for the coin that would clear his ledgers, had signed the papers and called it a blessing. So Clara had run. In the dead of night, she had packed the few things that were truly hers into a small carpet bag, a change of linen, a worn copy of Psalms, and the silver locket her mother had given her just before the fever took her. Inside the locket was a tiny, faded portrait of her mother's smiling face, a reminder that she had come from love, even if she had not seen it in a long time. With the last of the housekeeping money she had saved, she bought a ticket west, as far as the money would take her. In a boarding house in St. Joseph, shivering and alone, she had found the newspaper. Tucked between advertisements for patent medicines and farm equipment was a small, stark notice in the matrimonial columns. "Widower rancher seeks respectable woman for matrimony. Must be of good character, hard-working, and willing to relocate to Wyoming territory. No drunkards or women of loose morals need apply. Object, a well-kept home and partnership in labor. Send correspondence to Levi Morgan, Blackwater, Wyoming." There was no mention of love, no hint of affection. It was a business transaction, plain and simple. Clara wrote a letter with a trembling hand, omitting the parts of her story that would disqualify her, focusing instead on her skill with a needle, her ability to cook and clean, and her quiet nature. She presented herself as a respectable orphan seeking the stability of a good home. It was not entirely a lie. She sent the letter and prayed. Levi Morgan's reply was as spare as his advertisement. It contained a train ticket and a single sentence: "I will meet the Tuesday train." Now, Tuesday had arrived. Levi Morgan stood on the railway platform, a head taller than most of the men waiting for parcels and mail. He was 32 years old, but the land and his grief had carved another decade into his face. His shoulders were broad from a life of hard labor, his hands calloused and capable. He was a man made of the same tough material as the land he worked. 3 winters ago, a lantern had overturned in the night. He had woken to the roar of a hungry fire, a nightmare of heat and smoke. He had managed to stumble out into the freezing air, his lungs burning, his skin scorched. But his wife, Sarah, and their 4-year-old son, Jacob, had not. He had buried what was left of them on the hill behind the ranch house, under the lone pine that Sarah had always loved. After that, something inside him had burned out too. The laughter, the easy smiles, the simple warmth of being a husband and father. It all turned to ash. He worked from before sunup to long after sundown, throwing himself into the relentless demands of the ranch until exhaustion finally granted him a few hours of dreamless sleep. But the silence in the house was a constant, pressing weight. The town elders, particularly the parson's wife, had begun to make suggestions. A man needs a wife. Levi, a home needs a woman's touch. It is not right for you to live alone with your sorrow. He did not want to replace Sarah. The very idea was a betrayal. But he was practical. The ranch was too much for one man. Mending, cooking, cleaning, the tasks piled up. He needed help. He needed the appearance of a proper home to keep the gossips at bay. He did not need love. He could not afford it. So he had placed the advertisement, seeking not a wife for his heart, but a partner for his ranch, a presence to fill the deafening quiet. The train whistle shrieked, a mournful sound that echoed off the false fronts of Blackwater's main street. Steam hissed as the great iron engine ground to a halt. A few passengers disembarked. A drummer with a trunk full of wares, a family with 3 noisy children, and then a lone young woman. She paused at the top of the steps, clutching a small bag, and scanned the platform with wide, nervous eyes. She was thinner than he had imagined, and looked as if a strong gust of that Wyoming wind could carry her off. She wore a plain gray dress that seemed a size too big for her slight frame, clearly borrowed or bought secondhand. Her face was pale, her light brown hair pulled back in a severe bun that did little to soften the anxious set of her jaw. She was not beautiful in the way Sarah had been, all sunshine and rosy cheeks. This woman was a winter sparrow, muted and watchful. He stepped forward. "Miss Bethune." Her eyes, a startling shade of blue in her pale face, snapped to his. She gave a small, jerky nod. "Mr. Morgan." Her voice was quiet, barely a whisper against the noise of the station. "Welcome to Blackwater," he said, the words feeling stiff and unnatural in his mouth. He took her bag from her. It was so light it felt empty. "The wagon is this way." He did not offer his arm, and she did not seem to expect it. She fell into step beside him, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground. The silence between them was thick with everything unsaid. He was a stranger. She was a stranger. And in a matter of days, they were to be man and wife. It was a madness born of desperation. And Levi felt a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or regret. They had nearly reached his wagon, a sturdy buckboard hitched to a pair of placid geldings, when a voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "There she is, the little runaway." Clara froze, her whole body going rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving it as white as bone. 3 men were walking toward them, their steps deliberate and menacing. They were not from around here. Their clothes were too fine for this dusty cow town, and they wore their sidearms with an easy confidence that spoke of paid work. The man in the lead was older, with a florid face and a cruel twist to his mouth. "Clara, girl," the man said, his voice oozing a false paternal warmth. "Your uncle is worried sick, Mr. Abernathy is beside himself. It is time to come home." Levi stepped slightly in front of her, placing himself between Clara and the approaching men. He set her bag down on the wagon bed. "This woman is with me," he said, his voice low and flat. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The man sneered, his eyes flicking over Levi's worn denims and dusty hat with contempt. "This is a family matter. Friend. The girl is promised. We have papers from a Missouri judge. She belongs to another man." "She answered my advertisement," Levi stated. his gaze as hard and unyielding as granite. "She came here to be my wife. Her business in Missouri is concluded." Clara's hand flew to her throat, her fingers finding the familiar shape of the locket beneath her collar. She could feel the bile rising. The men kept advancing. One of them reached for her arm. "Come on now, Missy. No need to make a scene." Before the man's fingers could touch her, Levi moved. It was not the brawling style of a saloon fight. It was swift, economical, and brutal. His right hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it with a sickening crack of bone. The man howled in pain. Levi's left fist followed, a solid, driving blow that connected with the man's jaw and sent him sprawling into the dust. The other two men, shocked by the sudden violence, went for their guns. But Levi was already moving, shoving Clara behind the relative safety of the wagon wheel. He drew his own Colt Peacemaker, the motion fluid and practiced. He did not aim to kill. He was a rancher, not a gunman, but he knew how to defend what was his. "Get out of my town," he growled, the words a low rumble of thunder. The leader, recovering his nerve, drew his weapon. "She's worth more to us than you, rancher!" He fired. The shot went wide, splintering the wooden side of the buckboard. In the same instant, Levi fired back. His shot was true. It caught the leader in the fleshy part of his thigh. The man screamed, a sound of fury and agony, and collapsed, clutching his bleeding leg. The third man, seeing his partner down and his other companion nursing a broken wrist, lost his appetite for the fight. He stared at Levi's cold, steady gaze and the unwavering barrel of his Colt, then dropped his gun and raised his hands. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. Doors were opening up and down the street. The town sheriff, a portly man named Elias, came puffing up, his own gun drawn but clearly late to the affair. "Levi, what in tarnation is going on here?" "These men were attempting to abduct my intended," Levi said, his voice calm, though his knuckles were white where he gripped his pistol. Clara was pressed against the wagon, shaking so hard she could barely stand. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked from the man bleeding in the dirt to Levi, who stood over them like a vengeful god, his face a mask of cold fury. He had saved her. This silent, grieving stranger had stood for her when no one else ever had. The town judge, an old man named Horace Miller with a long white beard and eyes that had seen every kind of trouble the frontier could produce, arrived on the scene. He took in the situation at a glance, the wounded man, the cowed accomplice, the terrified young woman, and Levi Morgan standing guard. Judge Miller wasted no time. "Sheriff, get these two locked up," he commanded, pointing to the uninjured men. "And get Doc Adams for this one. I want them patched up and in a cell before sundown." He then turned his sharp gaze on Levi and Clara. "You two, my office. Now." The judge's office was a small, cluttered room that smelled of stale pipe smoke and old paper. He sat behind his heavy oak desk and steepled his fingers, looking at them over the top of his spectacles. Clara stood by the door, still trembling, while Levi stood near the window, staring out at the street as if watching for more trouble. "Son," the judge said to Levi, his voice gravelly, "you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Those men claim they have legal papers for this young woman, a contract of marriage from Missouri. Now, a Missouri paper does not hold much water in Wyoming territory, but it is enough to make things complicated. They will claim you kidnapped her. They will say you are holding her against her will." "She came of her own accord," Levi said, his voice tight. "She answered my advertisement." "I believe you," the judge said. "But belief is not law. What we have here is a jurisdictional mess waiting to happen. It invites trouble, the kind that gets men killed over property disputes. And right now, legally speaking, that is how they see this young woman, as property." Clara flinched as if struck. The word hung in the air, ugly and suffocating. The judge's eyes softened for a moment as he looked at her. "The surest way to put an end to their claim," he said, his gaze shifting back to Levi, "is to establish a stronger one. A Wyoming claim. The strongest claim there is. Levi turned from the window. He knew what the judge was suggesting. A marriage. Right now, the judge confirmed, nodding slowly. Tonight, I will perform the ceremony myself. Once she is Clara Morgan, wife of a Wyoming landowner, their Missouri paper becomes worthless. She will be under your legal protection, and under the protection of the laws of this territory. It is the only way to keep her safe and keep this from escalating into a range war. Levi looked at Clara. Her face was ashen, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something he could not name. He had promised her a partnership, a home. He had not promised this chaos. He had saved her from those men at the station, not out of love or chivalry, but because they were trespassing on his agreement. She was his responsibility now, for better or worse. He had given his word. He gave a short, sharp nod. All right. Clara felt the room tilt. Married, tonight, to this stone-faced stranger who had just shot a man for her. It was not a proposal. It was a strategy, a legal maneuver to save her from one owner by delivering her to another. Yet, when she looked at Levi, she saw no cruelty in his eyes, only a grim, weary resolve. He had protected her. That was more than anyone had ever done. She found her voice, a thread of sound in the heavy silence. I agree. The ceremony was held an hour later, as dusk settled over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The judge's office was their church. The sheriff and the judge's clerk were their witnesses. Clara still wore the borrowed gray dress. Levi had not changed out of his dusty work clothes. Judge Miller read the vows from a worn book, his voice droning on in the quiet room. Clara listened to the words, to love, honor, and cherish, in sickness and in health, until death do you part, and they felt like a language from another world. They had no meaning here, in this room, between two people bound by nothing more than necessity and violence. When it was time, Levi took her hand. His was large and rough, swallowing her smaller, trembling one. His touch was not gentle, but it was steady. It was real. She whispered, I do, and the words were stolen from her lips by the sheer force of her own disbelief. I now pronounce you man and wife, the judge declared, closing his book with a soft thud. You may kiss the bride. An awkward, heavy silence descended. Levi looked down at her, his gray eyes unreadable. He made no move. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he simply released her hand. The moment was over. The deed was done. She was Mrs. Levi Morgan. The ride to the ranch was long and silent. The only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves on the dirt road. The moon rose, a pale sliver in a black sky glittering with a million cold, distant stars. Clara huddled in her thin coat, the Wyoming wind cutting right through it. Levi sat beside her, a rigid silhouette holding the reins, his focus entirely on the trail ahead. The ranch house was a dark shape against the hills, a single lamp glowing weakly in one window. It was a simple, sturdy structure of timber and stone, built to withstand the elements. But as Levi helped her down from the wagon, a gust of wind moaned around the corners of the house, sounding like a person weeping. The place felt steeped in sorrow. Inside, it was clean but stark. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, cold and dark. The furniture was sparse and functional. There were no feminine touches, no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the bare wood floors. It was a place for surviving, not living. Your room is upstairs, Levi said, his voice rough. First door on the left. I will bring your bag up. He led the way, his boots echoing on the wooden stairs. The room was small, containing only a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small wooden wardrobe. It was cold, the chill seeping in through the window pane. Levi set her bag on the floor. He stood in the doorway, a large, intimidating presence in the small space. He seemed to fill it completely, leaving no room for her to breathe. The finality of her situation crashed down on her. She was married. This was her husband. This cold, empty house was her home. She was safe from Mr. Abernathy, but she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Levi turned to leave. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She could not bear to be left alone in this dark, silent room, in this house full of ghosts.
"Mr. Morgan,"
she whispered, her voice cracking. He stopped but did not turn around.
"My name is Levi."
The correction was not unkind, but it was not warm either. It was just another fact, another term of their agreement. Tears she had refused to shed for weeks pricked at the back of her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent trembling that had taken over her body. All the terror of the past few days, the escape, the confrontation, the rushed marriage. It all culminated in one desperate, whispered plea. "Will you still hold me tomorrow?" It was the question of a frightened child, not a new bride, a question not about passion, but about presence. A plea for the simple assurance that she would not be abandoned again, that the protection he had offered was not as fleeting as the last rays of sunlight over the prairie. Levi stood with his back to her for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the lonely cry of the wind outside. He did not turn. He did not speak. He just stood there, a bulwark of silence, before quietly pulling the door closed, leaving her alone in the dark. The first morning at the ranch began with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Clara woke to a cold gray light filtering into her room. The bed beside her was empty, the sheets crisp and undisturbed. For a moment, a disoriented panic fluttered in her chest, the familiar fear of waking up in a strange place. Then she remembered. She was Mrs. Levi Morgan. This was her home. She dressed quickly in the one other dress she owned, a simple brown calico, and made her way downstairs. The house was still and cold. The great stone fireplace was a black maw, filled with the gray ash of a long dead fire. There was no sign of Levi. A wave of the same desperate loneliness from the night before washed over her. Had he left? Had he ridden off and abandoned her to this empty house? Her question was answered by a movement outside the kitchen window. She saw him crossing the yard from the barn, his shoulders set against the sharp morning wind. He carried 2 pails of milk, his steps long and purposeful. He had not abandoned her. He had simply been working. He had likely been working for hours. When he entered the kitchen, he barely glanced at her. He set the pails down on the table with a thud. "There is coffee in the pot on the stove," he said, his voice as rough as burlap. "The stove is cold. I will get it going." He moved with a quiet efficiency, laying the kindling and striking a match. He did not ask if she had slept well. He did not mention the events of the day before. The wall of silence he had erected between them remained as solid and impenetrable as stone. And so their life began. A strange, silent dance of 2 strangers sharing a roof but not a life. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch through observation. She rose before dawn, forcing the sleepy warmth from her limbs to light the stove and put coffee on to boil. She cooked meals that Levi ate without comment, his eyes fixed on his plate. She cleaned the house, scrubbing away the layers of dust and neglect, trying to impose some sense of order on the stark, masculine space. She found Sarah's things packed away in a trunk in the attic, a few faded dresses, a book of poetry, a tiny pair of worn leather baby shoes. She closed the trunk gently, feeling like a trespasser on the sacred ground of Levi's grief. The ranch hands, a grizzled old-timer named Silas and a younger, wiry man called Jed, treated her with a wary distance. They tipped their hats when they saw her, their faces impassive, and referred to her only as the woman. She was an unknown quantity, a disruption to the hard, predictable routine of their lives. They watched her from the corners of their eyes, their suspicion a palpable thing in the air. She was the mail-order bride who had arrived with a gunfight on her heels. And in their world, trouble was a contagion best avoided. Levi's avoidance was the most painful of all. Each night, he would take a blanket from a chest in the main room and walk out the door toward the barn. He never said good night. He never explained. Clara would lie alone in the big, cold bed upstairs, the bed that should have been theirs, and listen to the wind howl outside. She knew he was sleeping in the hayloft, choosing the company of his horses and the lingering scent of his first wife's memory over the woman who now bore his name. She understood he was a man hollowed out by loss, but his rejection was a constant, dull ache in her chest. The past was a relentless hunter, and it found her in the dark. Her nights were plagued by nightmares, fragmented and terrifying. She would dream of a heavy, damp hand covering her mouth, the reek of whiskey on hot breath, a voice whispering things that made her skin crawl. She would see her uncle's face, his eyes shifty and weak, turning away as he sold her for his own comfort. She would wake with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the thin cotton of her night shift damp with a cold sweat. Sometimes a small, choked cry would escape her lips, but the house was always silent in response. She would lie there, trembling in the dark, wondering if Levi, out in the barn, could hear her, and if he did, if he even cared. 2 weeks into this fragile existence, the sky turned a flat, bruised gray. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of snow. Silas looked up at the sky, squinted, and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Big one's coming," he announced to no one in particular. "Gonna be a long one." He was right. By midday, the first flakes began to fall. Fat and wet, by dusk, it was a blizzard. A swirling, blinding wall of white descended upon the world, erasing the mountains, the prairie, and the horizon. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the window panes and finding every tiny crack in the log walls to send in fingers of icy cold. The world shrank until it was nothing more than the ranch house and the nearby barn. 2 small islands in a raging sea of white. For the first time, Levi did not go to the barn after supper. He could not. The short distance was a treacherous, impassable wilderness. He stood by the window for a long time, staring out into the storm, his jaw tight. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole world, he turned and laid his blanket on the floor by the hearth. The storm raged for 3 days. They were trapped, forced into a proximity that was both suffocating and strangely intimate. The constant howl of the wind made conversation nearly impossible. So they existed in their shared silence, moving around each other in the confined space of the house. Clara cooked and mended. Levi repaired a broken harness, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and awl. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, with the ghosts of his past and the demons of hers. On the second night of the storm, a new sound joined the chorus of the wind, a low, pained bellow from the barn. Levi was on his feet in an instant, his head cocked. He listened for a moment, then pulled on his heavy coat and boots. "Stay here," he commanded, and plunged out into the blizzard. Clara waited, her stomach tight with a nameless anxiety. She paced the floor, stopping every few moments to peer through the frosted window, but she could see nothing but the swirling white. An hour passed, then another. Just as she was beginning to succumb to a genuine fear, the door burst open in a flurry of snow. Levi stood there, his coat and hat caked in ice, his face raw from the wind. He was carrying something in his arms. It was a newborn calf, steaming in the cold, its legs spindly and weak. "The mother is having a hard time of it," he said, his words coming out in puffs of white mist. He carried the calf to the fireplace and gently laid it on a pile of old blankets he had put down earlier. "This one came too early. It is weak." The calf shivered, its breathing shallow. It made a pitiful, weak sound. Without thinking, Clara knelt beside it. She had grown up on a small farm before her parents had passed, before she had been sent to live with her uncle. She knew animals. She began to rub the calf's small body with a dry sack, working to stimulate its circulation and warm it. Levi watched her, his expression unreadable. He had gone back out to tend to the mother, and when he returned, his face was grim. She did not make it. A pang of sadness went through Clara. Another mother lost? She looked at the small, orphaned creature by the fire, and her heart ached. She continued her work, rubbing the calf until its shivering began to subside, and its breathing grew a little stronger. Levi fetched a pail, and using his finger, managed to coax the calf into drinking a little of the milk from its mother. They worked together through the night, a silent, efficient team. They took turns watching the calf, feeding it small amounts of milk and keeping it warm by the fire. Sometime in the small hours of the morning, the storm began to lose its fury. The wind died down to a low moan. In the quiet, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft sucking noise of the calf nursing from Levi's finger. Clara was sitting on the floor, her back against a wooden chair, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Levi was sitting on the hearth opposite her. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, softening the hard lines and revealing the deep weariness in his eyes. He was staring into the flames, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. "My son, Jacob," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the crackle of the logs. He would have liked this. He loved the animals. It was the first time he had spoken of his family. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Clara's heart ached for him. For the depth of the loss she could only begin to imagine.
I am sorry,
she whispered. It felt wholly inadequate. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement of a pain too deep for words. He reached out to add a log to the fire. At the same time, Clara reached for the poker to stoke the embers. For a fleeting second, the backs of their hands brushed against each other. His skin was rough and calloused, yet warm from the fire. The contact was electric, a jolt of simple human connection in the vast, cold emptiness of their lives. Clara pulled her hand back as if burned. Levi froze, his hand hovering over the logs. Their eyes met across the fire, and for the first time, Clara saw something other than grief or duty in his gaze. It was a flicker of awareness, of confusion, a recognition that she was not just a housekeeper or a legal necessity, but a woman, a living, breathing woman, sitting in his house. The moment stretched, taut and silent, before he broke eye contact and placed the log on the fire with a decisive thud. The spell was broken, but something had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall between them. When the snow finally stopped, the world outside was a pristine, white wilderness. The trip to town for supplies was a necessity. The gossip, Clara soon learned, was an inevitability. As she stood in the general store while Levi negotiated for feed, she could feel the eyes of the other women on her. She heard their whispered words, sharp as shards of ice. "That is her, the one Morgan brought in. Came with gunmen on her tail. I heard running from something back east. No doubt. A woman does not travel across the country alone unless she is in some kind of trouble." Their judgment was a physical force, pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. They saw her not as a person, but as a scandal, a harlot, a ruined woman. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands clutching her shawl, and wished she could disappear. A week later, the town's judgment arrived at their doorstep in the form of a traveling preacher, Reverend Blackwood. He was a tall, thin man with a severe face and eyes that seemed to look right through a person to tally up their sins. He arrived unannounced, his buggy pulling up to the ranch house just as Clara was hanging out laundry. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying an air of sanctimonious authority. "I am Reverend Blackwood. I make it my duty to visit all the families in my circuit, to offer spiritual guidance and ensure the flock is living in accordance with God's law." He was invited inside, as custom demanded. He sat at their kitchen table, accepting a cup of coffee but refusing a slice of the pie Clara had baked. Levi stood by the door, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud. The preacher's visit was not a social call. It was an interrogation. With his questions aimed squarely at Clara, he asked about her family, her upbringing, the reasons for her journey west. His inquiries were cloaked in the language of pastoral care, but their intent was sharp and cruel. "It is a most unusual union," the preacher said, his eyes gleaming with a cold fire. "Forged in haste and violence, the good people of Blackwater are concerned. A woman's reputation is a fragile thing. When it is marked, it can cast a shadow over the entire community." Clara's hands, resting in her lap, began to tremble. She could feel the color draining from her face. "My wife's reputation is not your concern," Levi said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The preacher ignored him, his gaze still fixed on Clara. "They say you were fleeing a prior arrangement, that you belong to another. The Bible is very clear on the sanctity of a promise. Mrs. Morgan, a woman who breaks her word." That was as far as he got. Levi crossed the room in 2 long strides. He stopped beside the preacher's chair, looming over him. "My wife and I were married by Judge Miller, according to the laws of this territory," Levi said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Our union is legitimate in the eyes of the law and of God. Your insinuations are not welcome in this house. You will leave, now." The fury radiating from Levi was so intense it was like a physical heat. It shocked Clara, and it clearly shocked the preacher. His face paled. He sputtered for a moment, then gathered his dignity, stood, and walked stiffly to the door. "You will regret this, Morgan," he hissed. "The Lord does not look kindly on those who harbor sinners." Levi closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his eyes closed. The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a profound weariness. He had defended her. He had called her his wife with a conviction that had stunned her. A fragile tendril of hope began to curl in her chest. But then he opened his eyes and looked at her, and the hope withered and died. The wall was back up, higher and colder than before. On his face was a complex mixture of guilt and turmoil. He had defended her, and in doing so, he had felt a surge of possessiveness, of a fierce, protective instinct that felt like a betrayal to the memory of the wife he had lost. The desire to protect Clara warred with his loyalty to Sarah, and the conflict was tearing him apart. Without another word, he turned and left the house, striding toward the barn, his sanctuary of grief. That night, the cold returned, and with it, the nightmares. Clara woke up shivering, the remnants of a dream about cold river stones for eyes and a soft, damp hand clinging to her. She could not bear the thought of being alone in the dark room. She slipped out of bed and went downstairs. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers, casting a soft, pulsing light into the dark room. She stood before it, seeking its meager warmth, wearing only her thin white cotton shift. The chill of the room raised goosebumps on her arms. She did not hear the back door open. She did not know Levi was there until she felt a subtle shift in the air, the presence of another person in the room. She turned, a small gasp escaping her lips. He stood by the kitchen doorway, a silhouette against the darkness. He had clearly just come in from the barn. Unable to sleep, he was staring at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. She clutched the front of her shift, suddenly self-conscious. As she turned, the firelight illuminated her back. The thin fabric of her shift did little to hide the story written on her skin. There, across her shoulders and down her back, was a faint, lattice-like pattern of old bruises, faded to a sickly yellow and green. They were the ghosts of Mr. Abernathy's impatience, the price of a moment of defiance. Levi's gaze fixed on the marks. His expression, barely visible in the firelight, tightened into something fierce and terrible. He took a half-step forward, and then stopped. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of the embers. Clara saw his hands, which were hanging at his sides. They were clenched into fists, the knuckles white, and they were shaking, not from cold, but from a raw, violent rage that had nowhere to go. He was seeing, for the first time, the physical proof of the horrors she had fled, and the sight of it shook him to his very core. The night Levi saw the bruises, something in the silence between them changed. It was no longer a quiet born of grief and awkwardness. It was now charged with a new, terrible knowledge. He did not mention what he had seen. The next morning, he was as remote as ever, but Clara could feel a difference. A simmering, tightly controlled rage radiated from him, a dangerous energy that he directed at his work. He chopped wood with a ferocity that split the logs in a single blow, and rode out to check the fences with his jaw set like a line of unyielding rock. Clara found herself treading softly around him, mistaking the source of his fury. She thought it was disgust, that the sight of her marred skin had branded her in his eyes as spoiled, damaged goods. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. The world beyond the ranch, however, was not content to leave them to their silent turmoil. Trouble, having once found them, was coming back for more. Jed, the younger ranch hand, rode in from town one afternoon, his horse lathered and his face grim. He found Levi by the corral, tightening a loose rail. Mr. Morgan," Jed said, swinging down from his saddle. "You had best hear this. There is a man in town, calls himself Mr. Price, says he is her uncle." Jed jerked his head toward the house, where Clara was tending a small herb garden she had started near the kitchen door. Levi stopped his work, his hands freezing on the wooden rail. He turned slowly to face Jed, his eyes narrowed. And he ain't alone," Jed continued, his voice low. "He has got a half-dozen men with him, hired guns by the look of them, and he is telling everyone who will listen that his poor delicate niece was abducted, kidnapped by you. He is waving around some paper from Missouri and demanding the sheriff come out here and arrest you and return his stolen property." The word property struck Levi like a physical blow. He looked over at Clara, who was gently patting the earth around a sprig of thyme, her face turned toward the weak afternoon sun. A fragile peace had settled on her features, a peace he knew was about to be shattered. The rage he had been suppressing all week coalesced into a single, cold point of deadly resolve. "Stay with Silas," Levi told Jed. "Keep a watch on the trail. Fire a shot if you see anyone coming, but do not engage them." He strode toward the house, his long legs eating up the ground. He did not go to town immediately. He went into the barn and emerged a few minutes later with a rifle, which he loaded with a calm, deliberate precision. The scene in Blackwater was worse than Jed had described. A crowd had gathered outside the saloon, a volatile mix of curious townsfolk and the rough men Mr. Price had brought with him. Clara's uncle stood on the boardwalk, a short, portly man with a red face and the self-righteous air of a victim. He was a weasel trying to pass himself off as a lion, and Levi felt a profound loathing for him. The town was split down the middle. Some looked at the uncle's wealth and his legal papers and saw a wronged man. They muttered about Levi Morgan bringing trouble to their doorstep, sheltering a woman of questionable character. Others, mostly the hardscrabble ranchers and their wives who knew Levi's quiet integrity, looked at the hired guns and smelled trouble of a different kind. The deciding factor was Sheriff Brody. He was a man who had nursed a bitter resentment for Levi for years. He had courted Sarah before she had chosen Levi, and he had never forgiven him for it. Brody saw this as his opportunity. He stood beside Mr. Price, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, an ugly, triumphant smirk on his face. "Levi," Brody said as Morgan approached, his voice slick with false authority. "This gentleman has a legal claim. He says you are holding his niece against her will." "She is my wife," Levi stated, his voice flat and cold. "We were married by the judge." "A marriage under duress," He claims, Brody shot back. He says you forced her into it after that business at the station. Frankly, it looks bad. A woman runs from a respectable engagement back east, and you snatch her up the day she arrives. Unless you can provide some proof this is a legitimate union, and not just a cover for something else. I will have to place the woman in protective custody until the circuit judge can sort it out. Protective custody was a lie. It meant locking Clara in a cell until Brody and her uncle could arrange to have her shipped back to Missouri and the waiting arms of Mr. Abernathy. Levi knew it. He looked at the sheriff's smug face, at the uncle's greedy eyes, and at the hard faces of the hired guns, and he knew he could not win this fight here. Not with words or fists. Not today. He gave a stiff nod. "You will have your proof," he said, and turned his back on them, walking away before his rage could make him do something he could not take back. He rode the 2 hours back to the ranch with a storm brewing inside him. He found Clara in the kitchen, a half-peeled potato in her hand, her face etched with worry. She had seen the rifle. She knew something was wrong. "We are leaving," he said, without preamble. "Pack a bag, only what you need. Warm clothes. We are riding up to the high country."
What is it? What has happened?
She asked, her voice trembling. "Your uncle is in town. He has brought men. He is trying to take you back." He did not soften the words. There was no time. "The sheriff is on his side. We cannot stay here." Her face went ashen. The potato fell from her hand and rolled across the floor. For a moment, she looked as if she might collapse. Then, a spark of the same resilience that had carried her across the country ignited in her eyes. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. "I will be ready in 5 minutes." He took them up into the mountains, following a winding, little-known trail that he and his father had used for hunting. The journey was punishing. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed. Patches of old, stubborn snow lingered in the shadows of the pines, and the wind had a biting edge that promised more to come. They rode in silence. The only sounds the clatter of the horses' hooves on the rocky ground and the whisper of the wind through the tall trees. That night, they made a cold camp in a sheltered ravine. As darkness fell, a sound echoed through the mountains, a long, mournful cry that raised the hair on Clara's arms. A wolf. Then another answered, closer this time. She moved nearer to the small fire, her eyes wide in the flickering light. Levi, sitting on the other side of the flames, seemed unconcerned. He simply picked up his rifle, fired a single shot into the blackness of the trees, and the howling stopped. He was a part of this wild country, and he knew its dangers. He was her only protection against them. The next day, they reached their destination. It was a small, one-room-line cabin, tucked into a grove of aspens, nearly invisible against the mountainside. It was a place Levi used during the summer roundup, a refuge from sudden storms. Now, it was to be their refuge from men. The cabin was rustic, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and 2 bunks built into the wall. It was small, confining, and it forced them into an intimacy that their large, silent ranch house had allowed them to avoid. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks now had nowhere to escape. It filled the small room, thick and heavy as smoke. For 2 days, they existed in this charged silence. Levi hunted, bringing back a rabbit for their supper. Clara cleaned the cabin, her hands needing the simple, repetitive motions to keep from shaking. The silence between them grew louder with each passing hour, freighted with everything he knew and everything she feared. On the 3rd evening, she could bear it no longer. He was staring into the fire, his face grim, the anger a palpable aura around him. She sat at the small table, her hands clenched in her lap.
Why are you so angry?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Is it because you are ashamed of me? Because of what he did? He looked up, his gray eyes dark in the firelight. He looked surprised, as if the thought had never occurred to him. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words. "No, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "I am not angry at you. I am angry for you." The distinction was a revelation. It was not disgust she had seen in his eyes, but a protective fury. The realization sent a tremor through her. He stood up and walked to the small, dirty window, looking out at the moonlit snow. "A man who does that to a woman," he said, his voice a low growl. "He does not deserve to draw breath." Emboldened by his words, by the crack in his impenetrable wall, she found the courage to speak the truth that had been poisoning her from the inside out. "It was not my uncle," she said softly. "It was the man he sold me to, Mr. Abernathy." Levi turned from the window, his full attention on her now. The firelight flickered across her pale, earnest face. "My mother," Clara began, her voice gaining a little strength as she unburdened herself of the story she had never told another living soul. "My mother was a gentlewoman. She loved books and flowers, but she was strong. When my father died and my uncle took us in, he began to see me as a commodity. When Mr. Abernathy started to call, my mother saw the look in his eyes. She tried to stop it. She told my uncle he could not do it, that she would not allow it." She paused, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "One night, he had been drinking. He came into my room. My mother heard him. She ran in and stood between us. He was angry. He pushed her aside, hard. She hit her head against the bedpost." Clara's voice broke. "She was never right after that. She grew weaker and weaker. The doctor called it a wasting sickness. But I knew he had killed her, just as surely as if he had used a gun. He killed her trying to protect me." Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She did not try to wipe them away. Levi crossed the small room and stood before her. He did not touch her. He just stood there, his presence a solid grounding force in her swirling sea of pain. "He promised my uncle he would forgive his debts if I married him," she whispered, looking up at him, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed grief. "My uncle agreed. The wedding was a week away. That is when I ran." She took a ragged breath, the confession she had been holding back finally spilling out. She reached out, her hand hovering in the air between them, not quite touching him. "Levi," she whispered, her voice raw with a vulnerability that stripped her soul bare. "I have never been touched by a man without fear." It was an admission of her deepest wound. It was an offering of a trust she did not know if she possessed. In that moment, he was no longer the grieving widower or the stoic rancher. He was just a man, looking at a woman who was offering him the broken pieces of her heart. Slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might shatter her, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his calloused thumb stroking the back of her hand. He drew her to her feet. He looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw a storm of emotions: rage for the men who had hurt her, sorrow for the pain she had endured, and something else, something tender and new and terrifying. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, a question. It was nothing like the brutal, bruising kisses she had been forced to endure from Abernathy. This was a kiss of comfort, of solace. She responded to it, a small, broken sound escaping her throat. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to clutch at the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. The kiss deepened. The initial tenderness gave way to a current of long-suppressed hunger, a raw physical desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. It was intense, demanding, a fire that threatened to consume them both. Levi's arms went around her, pulling her tight against his hard body. His hand slid into her hair, freeing it from its pins so that it tumbled down her back. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped. He pulled back, breathing hard, his whole body trembling. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut. "I cannot," he rasped, his voice thick with a self-loathing that stunned her. "I see those marks on your back. I am afraid I will hurt you." He was afraid of his own strength, afraid of becoming another man who would cause her pain. It was the most selfless, honorable thing she had ever known. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. She reached up and cupped his rough cheek in her hand, forcing him to open his eyes and look at her. In the flickering candlelight, she asked the question that held all of her hope and all of her fear. "Will you still hold me tomorrow?" His expression broke. The stoic mask crumbled, revealing the wounded, lonely man beneath. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. His voice, when he answered, was soft, almost broken. "Yes." It was the only answer she needed. It was a promise. It was everything. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to one of the narrow bunks. He laid her down gently and followed, his larger frame caging her in, not with threat, but with a profound sense of security. Their lovemaking was a quiet exploration, a rediscovery of what it meant to touch and be touched. It was tender at first, a slow, gentle healing of wounds both seen and unseen. He showed her that a man's hands could be kind, that a man's body could offer pleasure instead of pain. And she, in turn, began to unlock a passion she never knew she possessed, a fierce, desperate clinging to this man who had become her sanctuary. As the night wore on, their tenderness deepened into a fiery passion, a raw and honest claiming of one another. In the small, isolated cabin, surrounded by the vast, dangerous wilderness, two broken souls came together, and for the first time in a long time, they were not alone. The days in the mountain cabin were a fragile truce with the world. In the mornings, Clara would wake to the quiet reality of Levi's presence, not on the floor by a cold hearth, but in the bunk beside her. He would already be awake, watching the slow creep of dawn, but he would not move until she stirred. A new language was being built between them, one of shared glances, small, unconscious touches, and a comfortable silence that was the polar opposite of the tense, aching quiet that had defined their lives before. They were a man and a woman learning the shape of each other, not just in the dark, but in the simple, shared moments of daylight. But the world below did not wait. Their absence from the ranch was a vacuum, and in a small town like Blackwater, gossip rushed in to fill it. The story, crafted by Clara's uncle and amplified by Sheriff Brody, took on a life of its own. Levi Morgan had not taken his new wife to the mountains for her safety. He had fled with her like a thief in the night. They were fugitives, hiding from the law. The narrative painted Levi as a kidnapper and Clara as a willing accomplice in her own abduction. A woman of such loose morals that she would abandon a respectable engagement to run off with a reclusive rancher. The posse Sheriff Brody had threatened to form became a reality. He deputized a handful of men, including some of the hired guns who had come to town with Mr. Price, and declared his intention to ride up into the mountains and bring Clara back by force, citing Missouri property theft laws as his justification. Word of the posse reached the cabin on the wings of a cold wind, carried by Jed. He had ridden a dangerous, roundabout trail to avoid being seen, his young face tight with urgency. He found them sharing a cup of coffee by the fire, the scene so deceptively domestic it felt like a dream. "They are coming, Mr. Morgan," Jed said, forgoing any pleasantries. "The sheriff has a posse. He is telling everyone he is coming to reclaim stolen property. He is talking about you as if you are a common outlaw." Levi's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He rose to his feet, the quiet peace of the morning shattering around him. He went to the corner where his rifle leaned against the wall. "Let them come," he said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. "This is my land. We will fight them here." "No," a quiet voice said from the table. Both men turned to look at Clara. She stood up, her hands pressed flat against the rough wood of the table to keep them from shaking. There were no tears in her eyes, no sign of the frightened girl who had arrived in town weeks ago. Her expression was one of weary, resolute strength.
I have been running my whole life. Levi, she said, her voice clear and steady. From my uncle, from Mr. Abernathy, from the whispers and the looks. I ran all the way to Wyoming, and I will not run anymore. Running just tells them they are right to chase you.
She looked from Jed's worried face to Levi's grim one. We have to go back. We have to face them. In the open. In front of everyone. Clara, they will not listen to reason, Levi argued, his hand tightening on his rifle. Brody wants blood. Your uncle wants you. Then we will give them a truth they cannot ignore, she insisted.
Hiding up here makes us look guilty. It makes me look like your possession, something to be fought over. I will not be property. Levi, not his and not yours. I am your wife. We will go back and we will face them as a husband and a wife. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the fragile sparrow he had first met, but an eagle. Her spirit, so long caged and beaten down, was finally taking flight. She was right. To fight them in the mountains would be a battle of guns, but to face them in the town would be a battle of wills, a battle for her soul, and it was a battle she had to lead. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. Their return to Blackwater was a spectacle. As they rode down the main street, windows and doors opened. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare. Levi rode tall in the saddle, his rifle resting in its scabbard, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Clara, riding the gentle mare he had given her, held her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the pointing fingers and the hushed, ugly words that followed them like a cloud of dust. Sheriff Brody, looking cheated out of his manhunt, met them in front of his office. Well, well, he sneered. Look what the cat dragged in. Decided to stop running. Morgan? We were not running, Levi said, his voice even. We were having our honeymoon. Now, you wanted proof of our union. We are here to provide it. You will call a town hearing. In the church. Let the whole town hear the truth of it. Brody was taken aback. This was not the cornered fugitive he had expected. A public hearing was a risk, but to refuse would make him look weak. Fine, he spat. Tonight, in the church, and Judge Miller will preside. The church was packed. It felt less like a house of God and more like a courtroom, the air thick with tension and the scent of damp wool and nervous sweat. The pews were filled with the faces of the town, the curious, the judgmental, and the few who watched with sympathy in their eyes. Clara's uncle, Mr. Price, sat in the front pew with Sheriff Brody, looking smug and confident. Judge Miller sat at a table in front of the pulpit, his face grave. He called the hearing to order with a bang of his gavel. This is an informal proceeding, he announced, his voice carrying to the back of the small building, to hear the claims of Mr. Price of Missouri and the response of Mr. and Mrs. Levi Morgan. Mr. Price spoke first. He was a practiced liar, his voice dripping with false concern. He spoke of his beloved, simple-minded niece, who had been led astray and abducted by a man who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. He produced his papers from Missouri, the marriage contract to Mr. Abernathy, and presented it as a sacred, binding document. Sheriff Brody backed him up, speaking of Levi's violent nature, citing the gunfight at the station as proof. Then it was Levi's turn. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He simply stood before the town, a solid, immovable presence. Clara Bethune answered my advertisement for a wife of her own free will, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on the judge. She came to Wyoming to escape a life she did not want. I met her at the station, as promised. The men her uncle sent tried to take her by force. I defended her. Judge Miller married us according to the law. She is my wife, and I will protect her, as my wife and by my word. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a simple, powerful statement, but it was his word against the uncle's papers. Then, Judge Miller looked at Clara. Mrs. Morgan, he said, his voice gentler than before. Do you have anything to say?
Clara rose from the pew where she sat beside Levi. She walked to the front of the church, her steps slow but steady. She stood before the townsfolk, her hands clasped in front of her. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet at first and trembled slightly. "My uncle says I am simple-minded," she began. "He says I was led astray. He is right about one thing. I was led like a lamb to slaughter." She looked directly at her uncle, whose face was beginning to flush with anger. "He speaks of a respectable engagement. He does not speak of the man, Mr. Abernathy, a man who believes a wife is a piece of furniture you purchase, a man whose first wife died falling down the stairs." The whispers in the church grew louder. "My uncle speaks of a contract. I want to show you the contract, mister. Abernathy preferred to use—" Her voice gained strength. With a steady hand, she reached up and unbuttoned the high collar of her dress. She tilted her head to the side, revealing a thin, silvery scar that ran from just below her ear down to her collarbone. This was his response when I told him I did not wish to go for a walk with him one evening. A collective gasp went through the church. The women in the pews leaned forward, their faces a mixture of horror and recognition. "He says I am ruined," Clara continued, her voice ringing with a righteous anger now. "That I have a marked reputation. He is right. I am marked." She turned her back to the crowd with a fluid, deliberate movement. She pulled the back of her dress down just enough to expose her shoulders and the top of her back. In the flickering lamplight, the faded, yellowed bruises were still visible, a ghostly lattice of past brutality. "I am marked by the man my uncle sold me to." She turned back around, her eyes blazing. "I did not run from a respectable engagement. I ran for my life. Levi Morgan did not kidnap me. He saved me. He is the first man in my entire life who has stood for me, who has protected me. Yes, I am his wife. I am his wife by law and by choice. My choice." A profound silence fell over the church. The men looked uncomfortable, shuffling their feet and staring at the floor. But the women looked at Clara, and then at each other. Mrs. Miller, the judge's wife, gave a slow, deliberate nod of support. An older woman in the back pew, a rancher's wife known for her sharp tongue, said loudly, "Good for you, girl." A quiet murmur of assent rippled through the female half of the congregation. They were women who knew fear, who knew the quiet tyrannies of men, and in Clara's defiance, they saw a reflection of their own struggles. The tide had turned. Judge Miller looked at Mr. Price, his expression one of utter contempt. But Clara's uncle was not a man to be defeated by mere truth. He played his final, desperate card. He stood up, his face purple with rage. "This is all lies and hysterics," he boomed. He turned to Sheriff Brody. "I have offered a generous contribution to this town's coffers to see justice done." "Sheriff, $1,000. He then turned his venomous gaze on Levi. "And as for you, Morgan, my lawyers have been looking into your land grants. It seems the deed for your northern pasture, the one with the only reliable water source, has a clerical error. A legal challenge has been filed. It is my name on the new claim. The courts will find in my favor." The threat was clear. It was a dagger aimed at the heart of Levi's world. His ranch, the land his father had homesteaded, was now at risk. "Turn the girl over, and the claim disappears." "Mister," Price said, his voice a venomous whisper, "annul this sham of a marriage. Deny you ever cared for her, and your ranch is safe. But if you stand by this ruined woman, you will lose everything. Your land, your water, your legacy. You will be a pauper." Levy stood motionless, the color drained from his face. He looked at the land deeds his father had passed down to him, a legacy written in sweat and blood. He looked at the hostile faces of the men who would see him ruined. Then he looked at Clara, who stood before the town, her soul laid bare, her eyes pleading with him not to sacrifice himself for her. The choice was impossible. The past he had inherited or the future he was just beginning to find. That night, the house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of impending loss. Levi sat by the cold hearth, staring into the ashes, a broken man. Clara came and knelt before him, taking his large, calloused hands in hers. "Levi," she whispered, her heart aching at the pain in his eyes. "You cannot lose your home because of me. This is your life, your father's life. I will not be the reason it is destroyed." She took a shuddering breath. "I will go. I will leave in the morning. I will go somewhere he can never find me. You can tell them I ran away. You can save your land." He looked up then, his gray eyes finding hers in the dim light. He saw not a burden, but the woman who had woken him from his long, gray sleep. He saw the woman who had faced down her demons and the judgment of an entire town. He saw his wife. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling with a fierce, unwavering resolve. He held her for a long time, the only sound in the room the frantic beating of their two hearts. Then he leaned back, his hands framing her face, and whispered the words that would seal their fate, the words that were more binding than any vow spoken in a church. "I would burn the whole ranch to the ground before I ever give you up." Levi's declaration was a fortress, a wall of certainty built around Clara's fear. For one night, in the circle of his arms, she felt invincible. But fortresses can be besieged, and the enemy was already at their gates. The warning did not come as a rider with a message or a shout in the dark. It came as a flicker of unnatural orange against the black velvet of the night sky. A malevolent dawn rising in the wrong direction. A frantic whinny from the horse corral was the first alarm, followed by the terrified lowing of cattle. Levi was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers, his movements sharp with a primal urgency. By the time Clara reached the window, the horror was in full view. The outer barn, the one used for hay storage and sheltering the milk cows and their calves, was engulfed in flames. The fire roared like a hungry beast, spewing a column of black smoke and angry embers into the sky, turning the peaceful ranch yard into a vision of hell. They ran outside, the heat a solid wall against their faces. Silas and Jed were already there, shouting and throwing useless buckets of water against the inferno. The sound was a nightmare symphony, the crackle and groan of burning timbers, the high, piercing screams of animals trapped inside. Levi, his face a mask of grim fury, worked with the men to open the gates of the main corral, driving the panicked horses and steers out into the open pasture, away from the spreading flames. There was nothing they could do for the barn. It was a funeral pyre. They could only watch as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, silencing the last of the agonized cries from within. They stood there until the flames began to die down, leaving a skeletal, smoldering ruin against the first pale light of the true dawn. The morning after was a study in devastation. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt hay and something else, something sickeningly sweet that turned Clara's stomach. Levi walked through the ashes, his boots sinking into the gray powder. He stopped where the milking stalls had been. The bodies of 4 cows and 3 calves were visible, charred and lifeless. These were not just livestock. They were the future of the herd, the result of years of careful breeding, a part of his family's legacy. Clara stood by the fence post, her arms wrapped around herself, a cold, sick dread coiling in her gut. This was her fault. The words echoed in her mind with the force of a gospel truth. Her uncle's greed, Abernathy's cruelty. She had brought that darkness here, to this quiet, honorable place. She had brought it to this man who had lost so much already. The fire had not just burned a barn. It had burned away the fragile hope that had begun to grow between them. She was a curse. She watched Levi, waiting for him to turn to her, to offer some word of comfort, some shared sense of defiance, but he did not. He stood over the remains of his animals, and she saw him retreating, pulling back into the cold. silent fortress of his grief where she could not follow. The man who emerged from the ashes was not the one who had held her and promised her everything the night before. It was the Levi she had first met, a stranger with eyes full of ghosts and a rage so deep and quiet, it was more terrifying than any shout. He did not speak to her for the rest of the day. He worked with a grim, silent ferocity, his jaw clenched, his movements economical and devoid of any warmth. The wall between them was back, thicker and higher than ever, and this time it was mortared with her own guilt. For 2 days, the ranch was a place of mourning. The silence from the main house was a heavy shroud, and even the ranch hands spoke in hushed tones. Clara tried to speak to Levi, to offer an apology, an explanation, anything, but he would look right through her, his eyes as cold and gray as the ash that covered the yard. She felt herself shrinking, the strength she had found in the mountains withering under the weight of his silent condemnation and her own self-loathing. On the 3rd day, a buckboard rattled up the trail. It was driven by Martha, a widow whose ranch bordered the Morgan property to the south. She was a woman in her late 60s, with a face as weathered and creased as old leather and eyes that had seen more droughts, blizzards, and heartaches than most people could imagine. She had been a friend to Levi's parents and had watched him grow from a boy into a man. She found Clara sitting on the porch steps, staring blankly at the ruined barn. Martha sat down beside her, her movement stiff but sure. She did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. "I saw the smoke," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "Men who fight with fire are cowards." She looked at Clara, her gaze sharp and discerning. "And women who let cowards win are fools." Clara flinched. "This is my fault," she whispered, the words thick with tears she had refused to shed. "I brought this on him." "Nonsense," Martha snorted. "You did not swing the lantern. The fault lies with the man who paid for the kerosene and the one who struck the match. Guilt is a rocking chair. Child, it gives you something to do, but it does not get you anywhere." She placed a work-roughened hand on Clara's arm. "I have known Levi Morgan his whole life. I knew his wife, Sarah. She was a fine woman, but she was soft, like a summer rose. You," she said, her eyes boring into Clara's, "you are a piece of winter wheat. You have been threshed and winnowed, but you are still standing. That is what he needs. He does not need another rose to wilt. He needs a woman who will stand with him against the wind." Martha leaned closer. "Let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. The only way to win in this country is to fight like a man, but love like a woman. Out there," she said, gesturing toward the town, "you be as hard and clever as you need to be. You use their own rules against them. You do not back down, but in here." She patted her heart. "And in there," she nodded toward the house. "You love him. You remind him what he is fighting for. Right now, he is lost in his rage. He has forgotten. You have to go and remind him." Martha's words were a bucket of cold, clear water thrown in Clara's face. She was right. Hiding in her guilt, waiting for Levi to forgive her, was a coward's game. She had to fight. While a plan began to form in Clara's mind, Levi was channeling his own rage. He knew a direct confrontation with the uncle's hired guns was a fool's errand. It would only lead to more violence and play into Sheriff Brody's hands. He had to find a different weapon. He saddled his horse and rode to the county seat, a full day's ride away, telling no one but Silas where he was going. He went to the land registrar's office, a dusty, book-filled room presided over by a clerk with ink-stained fingers. Levi was not a lawyer, but he was a rancher. He knew land. He spent hours poring over the old survey maps and grant documents, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of his property. The uncle's claim was based on a clerical error. He had said. Levi searched for that error, his fingers tracing the spidery script of deeds written decades ago. And then he found it. Not a clerical error, but a blatant forgery. The new claim document filed by Mr. Price's lawyers contained a surveyor's signature and a notary seal. But when Levi pulled the original survey map from 20 years prior, He saw that the signature on the new document was a crude imitation of the real one, and the notary, a man named Silas Blackwood, had been dead for 5 years. It was a clumsy, arrogant fraud, conceived by men who believed no one would ever bother to check. Levi had the clerk make a certified copy of both documents. He finally had a weapon made of paper and ink, but it was sharper than any knife. Back in Blackwater, Clara put Martha's advice into action. She rode into town alone, her back straight, her face a mask of cold determination. She did not go to the general store or the dress shop. She went straight to the sheriff's office and stood on the boardwalk outside, where the whole town could see her, when Sheriff Brody emerged, a look of surprise on his face. She spoke, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet street. "Sheriff Brody," she called out, causing passers-by to stop and stare. "I am here to turn myself in." Brody blinked, confused. "What are you talking about, woman?" "My uncle, Mr. Price, claims I am stolen property," she said loudly, pitching her voice for the growing audience. "He accuses my husband of kidnapping me, so I am here. Arrest me, take me into your protective custody. Lock me in your jail cell. Let us see how the law of Wyoming feels about a man locking up a woman who has committed no crime, simply to satisfy the greed of a man from Missouri." She held out her wrists. "Go on, Sheriff, do your duty. Or is your badge only for harassing honest ranchers and protecting criminals who burn down barns in the middle of the night?" The challenge hung in the air. Brody's face turned a mottled red. He was being played, publicly shamed, and he knew it. Behind Clara, a group of women who had been watching from the steps of the general store, including the judge's wife, Mrs. Miller, and the sharp-tongued rancher's wife, began to walk toward her. They did not speak. They simply formed a silent, unmoving wall behind Clara, their arms crossed, their faces set in grim disapproval of the sheriff. They were a silent jury, and their verdict was clear. Brody was trapped. To arrest Clara now, with the town's most influential women watching, would be political suicide. To back down would be to admit defeat. He sputtered. "This is not the time or place." "This is the perfect time and place," Clara retorted. "The law is the law, is it not? Or does it only apply when it suits you and the man who is lining your pockets?" Checkmated. Brody retreated into his office, slamming the door behind him. A small, triumphant cheer went up from the women. Clara had not won the war, but she had won the battle. She had fought like a man, using logic and public pressure as her weapons. When Levi returned, he found a town buzzing with the story of his wife's public defiance. He found Clara at the ranch, waiting for him, a new light in her eyes. He showed her the papers, the proof of the forgery, and for the first time in days, the cold wall between them began to crack. They were a team. The final showdown took place in Judge Miller's office. It was not a public hearing this time, but a legal proceeding. Levi, Clara, the judge, a furious Mr. Price, and a humiliated Sheriff Brody were the only ones present. Levi laid the documents on the judge's desk. "This is the original survey map for the northern pasture, signed by surveyor Thomas Poole and notarized by Silas Blackwood in 1875, he said, his voice calm and steady. "And this," he pointed to the other paper, "is the claim filed by Mr. Price. The signature is a forgery, and the notary, according to county records, has been dead for 5 years. This claim is not just invalid, it is a criminal fraud." The blood drained from Mr. Price's face. His entire scheme, his leverage, had evaporated. He was exposed as a common cheat. Judge Miller studied the papers, his expression turning to stone. "Mr. Price," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "you are in a great deal of trouble." The uncle, a cornered rat, saw his entire world collapsing. His reputation, his money, his freedom, all of it was gone. In that moment, reason fled, and pure, malevolent rage took its place. With a guttural snarl, he pulled a small derringer from his coat pocket, aimed it at Levi, and fired. It happened in an instant. The deafening roar of the gun in the small room, the look of shock on Levi's face. He staggered back, his hand flying to his left shoulder as a dark red stain blossomed on his shirt. "Levi!" Clara's scream was a raw, primal sound of pure agony. She threw herself at him as he fell back against the wall, her body shielding his as if to protect him from a second shot. She clung to him, her face buried in his chest, sobs tearing through her. "No, no, no, don't you leave me! Please, Levi, do not leave me now!" Her terror, her desperate, all-consuming love for him, was laid bare for all to see. In that moment, no one in the room could doubt the truth of their union. Judge Miller, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury, slammed his fist on the desk. "Sheriff, arrest this man for attempted murder." Brody, finally shaken from his complicity, moved to disarm and handcuff the trembling, wild-eyed Mr. Price. The game was over. That night, back at the ranch, the world was quiet again. The doctor had been and gone, declaring the wound a clean shot through the shoulder muscle. It was painful, but not life-threatening. Clara sat on the edge of their bed, gently cleaning the wound as Levi leaned back against the pillows, his face pale, but his eyes clear. The silence in the room was no longer one of distance, but of profound, shared intimacy. She finished tying the bandage, her touch infinitely gentle. She leaned down and pressed her lips to the old, faint scar near the center of his chest, the one he had gotten in the fire that had taken his first family. She kissed the ghost of his old pain. He watched her, his expression softening into something she had never seen before, a look of complete and utter devotion. He reached out with his good arm and drew her down beside him, with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He pushed aside the fabric of her nightdress and found the faint, yellowed bruises along her ribs. He lowered his head and gently, reverently, kissed the fading marks of her past. He was kissing her scars, not to erase them, but to accept them, to make them a part of their story. They were two wounded people, finding their healing not in forgetting the past, but in holding each other in the present. The winter that followed the fire was long and hard, but it was a different kind of hardship. It was the honest struggle against the elements, not the insidious rot of human malice. Levi's shoulder healed slowly, a constant, dull ache that served as a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. But in the small, quiet moments of caring for him, a new and durable bond was forged between them. Clara learned the landscape of his body not with fear or passion, but with the gentle intimacy of a healer, the line of his jaw when he was in pain, the weary slump of his good shoulder after a long day, the way his breathing would deepen when sleep finally claimed him. And as the snows finally receded, melting in dirty rivulets that fed the thirsty earth, something else began to thaw. Spring came to Wyoming not as a gentle guest, but as a fierce, determined force of will. The prairie, brown and dead for months, exploded in a riot of pale green shoots. Patches of Indian paintbrush and wild lupine appeared on the hillsides like swaths of spilled paint. The creek, once choked with ice, now ran high and loud, its voice a joyful roar. It was a time of rebirth, and the land's promise of renewal seemed to seep into the very timbers of the Morgan Ranch house. Clara blossomed with the season. The timid, haunted woman who had stepped off the train was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that settled on her as comfortably as a well-worn shawl. She had found her place, not just in Levi's house, but in the world. She took over the ranch ledgers, her neat, careful handwriting bringing a sense of order to the chaotic numbers. She learned the names of all the cattle, the intricacies of trading for seed, and the delicate art of negotiating with the suppliers in town. Her trips to Blackwater were no longer an ordeal. The whispers had died down, replaced by nods of respect, the story of her confrontation with Sheriff Brody, who had since become a much more subdued and circumspect public servant, had become a piece of local lore. The women of the town, led by Mrs. Miller, now sought her out for conversation at the general store. They saw in her not a scandal, but a survivor, one of their own. She was no longer the mail-order bride. She was Mrs. Morgan, a woman of substance. The change in the ranch hands was just as profound. The wary distance was gone, replaced by a gruff, protective affection. Jed, who had once avoided her gaze, now made a point of bringing her a tin cup of fresh, hot coffee from the pot on the bunkhouse stove each morning as she worked in her garden. He would stand there awkwardly for a moment, talking about the weather, a shy smile on his young face. Even old Silas, a man not given to warmth, had softened. One afternoon, as she helped him mend a fence, he told her a long, rambling story about a stubborn mule he had once owned. The story had no real point, but at the end of it, he cracked a dry, wheezing laugh, and she realized it was his way of offering friendship. The greatest transformation, however, was in Levi. The laughter returned to him in small, unexpected bursts, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The first time it happened, they were working on the foundation for the new barn. Clara, struggling with a length of twine, had gotten it tangled in her hair and made a sound of exasperation. He had looked over, and a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. A rusty, unused sound. It startled them both. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a kind of wonder, as if he had forgotten what joy felt like. After that, it came more easily. He would laugh at her dry observations about the stubbornness of a particular calf, or at the way the barn cat would chase grasshoppers in the yard. Each laugh was a stone lifted from the great, heavy wall around his heart. They rebuilt the barn together. It was a slow, arduous process, a testament to their shared will. Levi, his shoulders still mending, could not do all the heavy lifting himself. Clara became his other arm. She learned to measure planks, to drive nails with a straight, sure stroke. She stood on ladders, her hair tied back, her face smudged with sawdust, and worked beside him from sunup to sundown. They were not just rebuilding a structure, they were building a future from the ashes of the past. Each new timber they raised, each nail they hammered home, was a declaration of their endurance. They were building a home, together. One evening in early summer, after the last of the new roof shingles had been laid, they walked out into the northern pasture, the one Levi had fought so hard to keep. The day's heat was bleeding out of the earth, leaving behind the cool, fresh scent of clover and damp soil. The sky was a deep, cloudless indigo, and a million stars were scattered across it like a handful of diamonds on dark velvet. A sliver of a moon hung low in the west, casting a pale, ethereal light over the rolling hills. They walked in a comfortable silence, their hands linked, their steps falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. They had passed the need for constant words. Their companionship was a quiet, steady thing, as reliable as the turning of the seasons. The new barn stood behind them, a dark, proud silhouette against the starlit sky, a symbol of their shared labor and their victory. Clara stopped by a small rise that overlooked the creek. The sound of the rushing water was a soft, constant whisper in the quiet of the night. She turned to face Levi, the moonlight catching in her eyes, making them shine. She took his right hand, the one that was strong and whole, and gently placed it over her heart. He could feel its steady, rhythmic beat beneath his palm. A quiet, powerful testament to the life that was in her, a life he had saved and that had, in turn, saved him. "Will you still hold me tomorrow?" she asked. The words were the same ones she had whispered in terror on their wedding night. But the question was entirely different. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. In their place was a quiet, shimmering hope, a gentle request for an assurance that was already hers, but that she needed to hear all the same. It was the question of a woman who was secure in her present, asking a beloved partner to affirm their shared future. Levi looked down at her, at the woman who had walked through fire and emerged stronger, the woman who had taught his broken heart how to beat again. His stoic, rugged face softened in the moonlight, his love for her so immense it was a physical presence between them. He did not answer with words at first. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead, a kiss of reverence and protection. Then, he lowered his head and captured her lips in a kiss that was deep and slow and full of all the words he could not say. It spoke of shared sorrow, of hard-won joy, of quiet mornings and long, peaceful nights. It was a kiss that promised forever. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, his gaze holding hers, his soul laid bare in his eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, steady whisper, as solid and enduring as the mountains that watched over them. Every day after, he drew her into his arms, and she rested her head against his chest, her heart beating in time with his. They stood there for a long time, two figures silhouetted in the moonlight, the vast, starry sky their witness. They were two people bruised and scarred by the cruelties of the world, but in each other's arms, they were no longer broken. They were whole. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.